So our first session for this morning is a spotlight session on SME and green financial inclusion, where we will feature initial findings from research on where financial inclusion is helping SMEs cope with the challenges of climate change events in a variety of settings. And our presenter is Ms. Sarah Corry, Policy Analyst from the Financial Inclusion of AFI. Sarah, thank you.
Hello everyone. So we currently have a study going on at AFI on SME finance and green financial inclusion. We've got an SME finance working group, so it's one of the more relevant areas that we see that we'll be working in for green financial inclusion. So I'm just going to basically tell you a little bit about the initial findings for this study. Climate change is impacting SMEs, and it's impacting on a number of fronts. Basically, with more increased disaster events and extreme weather events, there is damage to assets for SMEs, like machinery or inventory, and this disrupts the business process. Particularly sensitive sectors are agriculture, which we know by now, having discussed it quite a lot in the context of insurance, and food processing. It's just very exposed and sensitive to weather events. And micro and small enterprises specifically don't have that many resources to bounce back after an event, a catastrophic event, for example, financial means specifically. And after a series of shocks, for example, a drought followed by a flood, followed by another drought, the ability to bounce back diminishes. So basically, resilience capacity kind of shrinks. But while SMEs are victims of climate change disasters, they also have massive potential to mitigate climate change, so reduce the impact of greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll look at SMEs through two lenses, adaptation and mitigation. I think those are terms we're all comfortable with by now. Basically looking at how SMEs can adapt to climate change through specific policy interventions or financial tools, and what are the implications for you as the regulators. And on the other side of mitigation, how do SMEs contribute and how can they benefit from mitigation? And what are the role of the regulators in this context? So we'll start off with adaptation. And in this particular study, we go through a three-step process. We look at the context of SMEs in the climate change lens. Then we look at options for instruments, policy instruments, financial instruments, and then we look at the policy recommendations. And these are the very initial findings, so we'll eventually get to a point where we can consolidate this information, but at this point we are at the very beginning of our analysis. So SMEs in the context of adaptation. What we have available to us are observed and predicted climate trends. So there's acute events like hurricanes, droughts, storms, typhoons, and then there's the more slow onset events like sea level rise and decreased precipitation over a number of years. And this is what SMEs tend to be vulnerable to the shocks, the sudden shocks, and to the slow onset events. And as I mentioned, they have less resources to cope with these sudden shocks. And then we have the existing measures, strategies and policies that are already in place. And for example, national financial inclusion strategies, national adaptation plans, disaster risk frameworks, and often government, private sector, or donor-led projects that try to support SMEs. So this is the context, and we are trying to fill the gap between, basically fill the vulnerability gap. So based on this, we can kind of look at a couple of options. The report looks at SMEs through the lens of an adaptation framework, and this relies quite heavily on a disaster risk management framework. So these concepts aren't entirely new. There's specific measures that can be taken before a disaster and after disaster. So there's prevention measures like hazard mapping, look at which areas are most vulnerable. There's finance and insurance measures, which we've spoken about at length, like index insurance, for example. Preparedness measures, which tend to be non-financial means, like early warning systems, which I'm sure you're familiar with here in the islands. And then there's the post-disaster mechanisms, like response, so providing direct relief after a catastrophe, and then recovery mechanisms like long-term and medium-term reconstruction. And this applies to SMEs in the context of infrastructure. But due to time constraints today, we're just going to look at the one segment on financing and insurance. So when we think about finance insurance, in the context of SMEs, regulators can play a very specific role in incentivizing product development. And this happens on 3 levels: national, institutional, and individual levels. And for example, on a national level, and a very basic example is just increasing insurance literacy. There's little uptake of insurance, microinsurance or inclusive insurance for SMEs, and often because the upfront cost is prohibitive and people don't think about the long-term value of money, the monetary value. Then we've got institutional level interventions or products that could be promoted. So meso level products protecting financial institutions themselves with insurance products, or as we've discussed, insurance subsidies and this is specifically for micro and small enterprises, which often can't afford the increase in premiums following a disaster, and in the long term, sometimes subsidies are necessary. And then you've got the individual level interventions, which one of the examples that has come up is just defining turnaround times for claim payouts following a disaster. This allows SMEs to bounce back much quicker, and it's very important that they're able to contribute to the economy as soon as possible after disasters. This is obviously important for the economy itself, but just generally for the business resilience, a defined turnaround time for insurance payouts can be quite helpful, and this is something regulators can actually do. So we have a number of case studies. For example, we actually have 2 from the Philippines. This one is mostly about that national level communication, raising awareness. The Philippines Insurance Association was finding that very few people were taking up insurance, and they decided they were going to use this innovative channel, or not so innovative, just YouTube, and basically just produce these very short 10-minute videos in very simple language about the benefits of insurance, and that was seen to be very highly successful, and it really created a better channel of communication about those benefits. Also in the Philippines, we have CLIMBS, which is a kind of an umbrella risk pooling mechanism for cooperatives. So it's donor-based, it's based on project funding, and about 1,700 cooperatives are part of this umbrella organization. And it's based on weather index insurance, so it provides kind of a hedge to those cooperatives' risks in light of a catastrophe. And the index-based insurance creates both protection for the cooperatives themselves as financial institutions, but also for the shareholders and their investments. And it enables them to rebuild their lives after an extreme weather event. Basically, it's a kind of like a reinsurance mechanism, but it's a risk pool for cooperatives. And then just something to keep in mind in general about this disaster risk framework approach or adaptation for regulators. You kind of have to step beyond the kind of stakeholders that you already engage with on a strategic level. So something that we really want to press is that it requires an extra level of coordination among stakeholders. And this wheel, these are different preparedness mechanisms and measures, they can't be taken in isolation. It's kind of something that has to happen along a process. So no one measure will help you adapt, but it's kind of looking at it holistically. Before and after a disaster, all these different measures kind of have to come together. So we can move on to the mitigation side, looking at MSME's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, but also how can they benefit from green finance or finance that's channeled at mitigating climate change. And then what is the role of the financial policy maker or regulator? We take a similar three-stage analysis, and we can look at the current situations of MSMEs. So I think there is awareness that MSMEs lack access to finance quite generally across the board, even though that they can play a great role in stimulating the green economy or the transition to a green economy. At the same time, MSMEs can actually be large contributors to greenhouse gases. It might not seem so obvious, but when you think about the collective impact of small-scale farmers, for example, who use slash and burn, or perhaps are deforesting large tracts of land, collectively it actually makes an enormous impact on greenhouse gases. Even though industry should take the bulk of kind of the blame maybe, MSMEs can definitely be brought in to look at their own responsibility. And similarly, there's existing measures that are trying to engage with MSMEs from the private sector, government sector, but maybe not so much on the financial front. And these are things like the National Financial Inclusion Strategies, nationally determined contributions, which are basically the Paris Agreement commitments every country has, and climate change finance frameworks. So taking into account this context, we can also, again, start looking at this through a mitigation lens. And it's quite simple. At this stage, where we see the gaps is through awareness and capacity building, refinancing or creating more access to green finance for SMEs, and through regulation just quite directly. So taking into account the challenges of SMEs and for financial institutions who are providing access to finance for SMEs. There's just a general lack of awareness about what is green lending, what is green banking, and what projects should be supported to transition into a greener economy. And there's some tested solutions, and so I'll show you some case studies for this. One example is including green investment in national financial inclusion strategies, specifically for SMEs. It's kind of a policy signal to the financial sector that, these are maybe a selection of the bankable green products we see that you should be offering to SMEs. And that's just basically a promotional thing, promoting green lending and using capacity building to make sure that banks know what the definitions are, how green or what shades of green they should be focusing on. So one of the case studies that we've found is the Central Bank of Myanmar. They are basically creating awareness among financial institutions to support particular green projects for SMEs. And this is kind of sector specific. So in the food and beverage industry, which consumes a lot of energy and it consumes a lot of water, they've identified that specific kinds of project funding can reduce this over-reliance on resources that should kind of be better managed. And the central bank is quite instrumental in that process. And then another very basic example, this one from the private sector, is communication about green lending. This is just a green lending booklet, and that's used by the banking sector and other financial institutions. In terms of access to finance, the obvious example for SMEs is that there's high risk and high cost of investing in green technology or going into an emerging sector, and we've seen this in the solar sector where 15 years ago it was extremely expensive to invest in solar technology. But now, because of certain policy tools, it's much more affordable, and the entire sector has been able to emerge, and SMEs can quite readily invest in what was once a little-used technology. And what we've seen we have some examples from Morocco and from Jordan in the AFI membership, where grants for innovative green products have been used, or grants for green entrepreneurs has been a direct mechanism to stimulate this small businesses. Then there's also credit guarantee schemes for green technology, specifically for SMEs, and refinancing facilities for renewable energy. In terms of direct regulation, there's several challenges, but we've identified small tweaks that could be made that could address them, and it's nothing incredibly new. So we have a general lack of incentives for green lending or green finance. SMEs have the challenge of risk and liquidity premiums, which constrain long-term financing. The benefits of green finance are generally quite unclear, both for SMEs and for financial institutions. And I think across the board, and something maybe that has come up quite a lot, is that there's a lack of clear and transparent standards and definitions for green finance. And the potential solutions, maybe somewhat controversially, are to restrict brown finance incentives. So by taking away some kinds of finance, it's redirected into greener industries. Lending quotas for green projects, and we also have a couple of examples from our own network on this. ESG management or environmental risk management. And then something that's cropping up quite a lot is defining and certifying green finance, establishing standards for what is green, and using that across a central bank or a banking sector so that everybody is kind of working towards the same target. And just one example of this, which we actually came up yesterday, is Bangladesh Bank, because there was concern about what is green, what isn't, which direction are we going in. There is now a portfolio that financial institutions can look at with very specific green projects and by different sectors about which parts of the industry should we be focusing on, which projects and technologies should we be stimulating. So there's actually basically a portfolio that you can refer to as a financial institution. So this is basically it. I know I've kind of blazed through quite a lot of information, but like I say, we'll probably have a report on this in the next 2 months. But hopefully it's given you something to think about. Just, I suppose, the takeaway points in terms of adaptation for SMEs, the main point is it's a holistic approach, and there are multiple measures that need to be considered, and this comes with the concern about stakeholder coordination. And basically what is needed for SMEs is more liquidity or access to additional finance in disasters or following disasters. And this just gives people more options and flexibility to adapt. For mitigation, it seems like the particular areas is capacity building and awareness, improving access to finance for green projects, and establishing rules and regulations on green criteria. So that is it.